So moving on to section 1, right? So section 1, no one had questions on 1 through 5. That's fine. We did have a question on 7. Why didn't China experience a scientific revolution? Why is that important? And the quick answer is, even though they were exposed to science through people like Matteo Ricci, and they appreciated the ability to be able to do astronomy and chart the heavens and make calendars and predict eclipses and all that, they just hired Jesuits to do the work for them, and they trained some Chinese astronomers. But because Confucianism emphasized moral knowledge over technical knowledge, being a scientist in China was not a big deal. If you're smart, you're not going to become a scientist. You're going to become a government official. This is very different from, say, Frederick the Great, who would pay scientists, if they developed useful inventions. So even though the Chinese are going to be exposed to modern Western science, or early modern Western science, that could have given them astronomy to math to engineering, machines, industrial revolution, all that wonderful stuff. They just don't pursue it. They just don't see how important it can be. They don't reward scientists for being scientists. They just hire the Jesuits and a few people to do the work for them. Why did many Chinese people oppose the new Qing dynasty? How did the Kangxi emperor convince Chinese people that Qing dynasty had the mandate of heaven? So remember, the Ming dynasty was overthrown by rebels. And then what happened was the Manchus came in from north of the Great Wall and took over China. As a general rule in Chinese history, people who live north of the Great Wall are barbarians. You build the wall to keep them out. And they just came in and took over. So many Chinese people said, well, how can these guys, these barbarians, possibly have the mandate of heaven? And that's why I made a big deal about, I want you to remember that they were Manchu, so you keep that in mind, right, that they're considered barbarians. And I showed how they were able to convince the Chinese. We looked at Kangxi emperor, who accepts Confucianism. So there was this argument, how can barbarians rule us? How could they receive the mandate of heaven? And then the Kangxi emperor promotes exams. He presents the Confucian exams. He keeps that system. He has images of this made of him where he's a scholar surrounded by books. He goes to the temple of Confucius and worships Confucius. And so Chinese say, oh, I guess he's not a barbarian. Right? If you accept Confucianism, accept Chinese culture, you're no longer a barbarian. Yes, Chris?
Were the Manchus or other barbarians spoke Chinese, the language was still Chinese?
No, they spoke completely different language. So that's why, one reason they're considered barbarian. Different language, different culture, different religion. So that's why they seem so different from the Chinese, and they saw them as barbarians. For example, before this, they weren't really Confucian.
What would that language even be?
Manchu. Yeah, they had their own. It's related to Mongolian. And they had their own writing system that was different from Chinese, too. It's really fascinating stuff, and I teach a class on modern China where we go into deep detail about the Manchus. So, unfortunately, I just taught it. But good questions. How did the stability the Qing brought and crops from the Americas influence China? Well, it made things better, right? They brought stability. Remember, the Ming were doing a bad job at the end. This led to population growth, led to more trade, led to more people living in cities. And when you live in cities, you have more opportunities for cultural interaction and increased wealth. And the way historians like to measure this is we like to look at population. When population goes up, generally, that means life is good, at least for a time. And population goes up during this time. Wow, lots of questions here. Okay, what was the relationship between Korea and China like? Why did both find the relationship acceptable? So remember, Korea had accepted Chinese Confucian culture, Chinese writing, Chinese morality, and their Chinese exam system. And the Korean king accepted the Chinese emperor, and it is important, those terms. A king is below an emperor. From China's perspective, there's only one emperor in the world, and he's in China. But the Korean king accepted the Chinese emperor as the older brother and offered tribute. The Chinese liked that because it emphasized political legitimacy, right? We're the center of the world. Look, these people from far away, well, not so far away, but our neighbors recognize how awesome we are. That encourages our political stability, and it makes sure that Korea is an ally. So if Japan were to want to invade China, the Koreans would try and stop them, which is what happened during the Imjin War. This also helped the Koreans because in Confucianism, you can't beat up your younger brother as much as you would like to. You have to defend and protect your younger brother. I'm always having to stop my kids from fighting. But the key thing here is that this gives Korea security. You're not allowed to invade them, right? They accept you. They pay tribute. You're the older brother. You have to protect them, which China did when Japan invaded. This also gave Koreans the opportunity for trade. But even though Korea accepted China as its older brother, Korea was still independent. It had its own army, its own diplomats, and there were no Chinese officials, no Qing officials stationed in Korea. So that's kind of a win-win for everyone here. What were the characteristics of the turtle ship? What other forms of advanced military technology were used in the Imjin War? Why didn't Korea and other East Asian countries develop more advanced military technology? So, oops. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. How did the Korean king justify his right to rule? How did Koreans justify independence from China? The Korean king was a Confucian king. He ruled by saying, I rule for the good of the common people. But Korean customs are different, so we have to shape Confucian civilization to Korea. And you can kind of see this Korean assertion of identity in King Sejong having a Korean alphabet developed so Koreans could write in Korean rather than writing in Chinese. Remember, Koreans before this had to write in Chinese, so that would be like speaking English at home and then having to write your assignments in French, which would be really difficult, but that's what the Koreans had to do. Curiously, to show how these things are connected, one of the first things he had translated into Korean were Confucian books. So it all kind of connects. Here we go. What were the characteristics of the turtle ship? What other forms of advanced military technology were used in the Imjin War? Why didn't Korea and other East Asian countries develop more advanced military technology? So remember, Japan will invade Korea to get to China in the Imjin War. A joint Korean-Chinese army will defeat Japan. And we talked about different types of military technology to show how Asia is developing good military technology. The Koreans had these turtle ships. Remember, they had powerful cannon that could shoot you from far away. If you got up close, they were protected from boarding by these spikes. And they even can shoot out poison or toxic gas or a cannonball from the mouth. So very advanced weapon. I have to emphasize, the Koreans had a lot of these, and they were used effectively. Right? They had a lot of these, and they were used effectively. So the Japanese, remember, got guns from the West and used effective tactics with that, right? You can see in this image here, not only are they using the guns successfully, they have a system of lines set up, and they have this interesting system of barriers made up so to defend themselves. The Chinese would deploy amazing cannon that were very powerful. The Koreans had rocket launchers and rocks, which I just love this juxtaposition here. But the Koreans even had rocket launchers. Now, why did they stop developing this military technology? Well, after this war, there weren't a whole bunch of big wars in Asia. Certainly not as many as you had in Europe. So because of that, they don't need to focus on developing weapons. People in peacetime, unless they feel they're under threat, are not going to spend precious resources developing weapons. So in a sense, they're the victims of their own stability and peace. Oops. Okay, how was Korea's relationship with China different from Japan's relationship with China? China and Japan are close enough that Japan could borrow Chinese culture, Chinese writing, Confucianism, Buddhism, but unlike Korea, was far enough away that China was not a military threat. Right? If the Koreans made the Chinese angry, theoretically the Chinese could invade. It was much harder for the Chinese to invade Japan. So this gave the Japanese more freedom. So for example, one thing the Japanese did was they said they had an emperor who was the equal to the Chinese emperor. The Chinese hated that, were very upset by that, but that little bit of ocean meant the Chinese couldn't do anything about it. Why did the Portuguese bring with them when they came to Japan? Why did many Japanese welcome them? So remember, you had these Portuguese explorers and merchants who were going to start coming to Japan in 1543. Jesuit missionaries will accompany them, and so they will bring with them Catholicism, right? They're going to help spread the religion. And some Japanese will convert because they believe it's true, but others will convert because they're more likely to be able to trade with the Portuguese if they become Catholic. There's a civil war going on in Japan. One nice thing to have is money when you're fighting a civil war because you can build a better army. Well, trade gives you more money. And especially it's useful if you can trade for guns. And the Portuguese brought guns with them, and that gave the Japanese this new form of technology. So let's see. All right. That gives us, we got a couple extra minutes.